right? Maybe I do belong. And a similar story is that this was just this unbelievable hit because at the time everybody needed $500,000 to do virtual reality, and everybody felt frustrated. And we literally hacked together a system for about $5,000 in parts and made a working VR system. And people were just like, oh my God, it's like, the Hewlett-Packard Garage thing. This is so awesome. And so I'm giving this talk, and the room has just gone wild. And during the Q&A, a guy named Tom Furness, who was one of the big names in virtual reality at the time, he goes up to the microphone and he introduces himself. I didn't know what he looked like, but I sure as hell knew the name. And he asked a question. And I was like, I'm sorry, did you say you're Tom Furness? And he said, yes. I said, then I would love to answer your question, but first, will you have lunch with me tomorrow? And there's a lot in that little moment, right? There's a lot of humility, but also asking a person where he can't possibly say no. And so Imagineering, a couple of years later, was working on a virtual reality project. This was top secret. They were denying the existence of a virtual reality attraction after the time that the publicity department was running the TV commercials. Okay, so Imagineering really had nailed this one tight. And it was the Aladdin attraction where you would fly a magic carpet. And the head-mounted display, sometimes known as Gator Vision. And so I had an in. As soon as the project had just, they started running the TV commercials. And I had been asked to brief the Secretary of Defense on the state of virtual reality. Okay, Fred Brooks and I had been asked to brief the Secretary of Defense. And that gave me an excuse. So I called them up, I called Imagineering, and I said, look, I'm briefing the Secretary of Defense. I'd like some materials on what you have because it's one of the best VR systems in the world. And they kind of pushed back, and I said, look, is all this patriotism stuff in the parks a farce? And they're like, okay. They said, but the PR department doesn't this is so new, the PR department doesn't have any footage for you, so I'm going to have to connect you straight through to the team who did the work. Jackpot. Right? So I find myself on the phone with a guy named John Snoddy, who is one of the most impressive guys I have ever met. And he was the guy running this team, and it's not surprising they had done impressive things. And so he sent me some stuff. We talked briefly. He sent me some stuff, and I said, hey, I'm going to be out in the area for a conference shortly. Would you like to get together and have lunch? Translation. I'm going to lie to you and say that I have an excuse to be in the area so I don't look too anxious. But I would go to Neptune to have lunch with you. And so John said, sure. And I spent something like 80 hours talking with all the VR experts in the world, saying, if you had access to this one unbelievable project, what would you ask? And then I compiled all of that, and I had to memorize it, which anybody knows me knows that I have no memory at all, because I couldn't go in looking like a dweeb with, hi, question 72. Right? So I went in, and it was like a 2-hour lunch, and John must have thought he was talking to, some phenomenal person, because all I was doing was channeling Fred Brooks and Ivan Sutherland and Andy Van Damme and people like that, and Henry Fuchs. So it's pretty easy to be smart when you're parroting smart people. And at the end of the lunch with John, I sort of, as we say in the business, made the ask. And I said, I have a sabbatical coming up. And he said, what's that? The beginnings of the culture clash. And so I talked to him about the possibility of coming there and working with him. And he said, well, that's really good, except, you're in the business of telling people stuff, and we're in the business of keeping secrets. Right? And then what made John Snoddy was he said, but we'll work it out. Right? Which I really loved. The other thing that I learned from John Snoddy, I could do easily an hour-long talk just on what have I learned from John Snoddy. One of the things he told me was that wait long enough and people will surprise and impress you. He said, when you're pissed off at somebody and you're angry at them, you just haven't given them enough time. Just give them a little more time, and they'll almost always impress you. And that really stuck with me. I think he's absolutely right on that one. To make a long story short, we negotiated a legal contract. It was going to be the first, some people refer to it as the first and last paper ever published by Imagineering. But the deal was I I provide my own funding, I go for 6 months, I work with the project, we publish a paper. And then we meet our villain. I can't be all sweetness and light because I have no credibility. Somebody's head's going to go on a stick. Turns out that the person who gets his head on the stick is a dean back at the University of Virginia. His name is not important. Let's call him Dean Wormer. And Dean Wormer has a meeting with me where I say I want to do this sabbatical thing, and I've actually gotten the Imagineering guys to let an academic in, which is insane. I mean, if John hadn't gone nuts, this would never have been possible. It's a very secretive organization. And Dean Wormer looks at the paperwork and he says, well, it says they're going to own your intellectual property. And I said, yeah, we got the agreement to publish the paper. There is no other IP. I don't do patentable stuff. And he says, yeah, but you might. So deal's off, and just get them to change that little clause there, and then come back to me. I'm like, excuse me? And then I said to him, I want you to understand how important this is. If we can't work this out, I'm going to take an unpaid leave of absence, and I'm just going to go there, and I'm going to do this thing. And he said, hey, I might not even let you do that. I mean, you've got the IP in your head already, and maybe they're going to suck it out of you, so that's not going to fly either. It's very important to know when you're in a pissing match. And it's very important to get out of it as quickly as possible. So I said to him, well, let's back off on this. Do you think this is a good idea at all? He said, I have no idea if this is a good idea. I was like, okay, well, we've got common ground there. Then I said, well, is this really your call? Isn't this the call of the Dean of Sponsored Research? If it's an IP issue? And he said, yeah, that's true. I said, so if he's happy, you're happy? Yeah, then I'd be fine. Like Wile E. Coyote, really. And I find myself in Gene Block's office, who's the most fantastic man in the world. And I start talking to Gene Block, and I say, let's start at the high level, since I don't want to have to back out again. So let's start at the high level. Do you think this is a good idea? He said, well, if you're asking me if it's a good idea, I don't have very much information. All I know is that one of my star faculty members is in my office, and he's really excited, so tell me more. Here's a lesson for everybody in administration. They both said the same thing. But think about how they said it. Right? I don't know! No, I don't have much information, but one of my star faculty members is here, and he's all excited, so I want to learn more. They're both ways of saying I don't know, but boy, there's a good way and a bad way. So anyway, we got it all worked out. I went to Imagineering, sweetness and light, and all's well that ends well. Some brick walls are made of flesh. So I worked on the Aladdin project. It was absolutely spectacular. I mean, just unbelievable. Here's my nephew Christopher. This was the apparatus. You would sit on this sort of motorcycle type thing, and you would steer your magic carpet, and you would put on the head-mounted display. The head-mounted display was very interesting. It had two parts, and it was a very, very clever design. To get throughput through, the only part that touched the guest's head was this little cap, and everything else clicked onto it, all the expensive hardware. So you could replicate the caps because they were basically free to manufacture. And this is what I really did, as I was a cap cleaner during this event. I loved Imagineering. It was just a spectacular place. Just spectacular. Everything that I had dreamed. I love the model shop. People crawling around on things the size of this room that are just big physical models. It was just an incredible place to walk around and be inspired. I'm always reminded when I went there and people said, do you think the expectations are too high? And I said, you ever see the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where Gene Wilder says to the little boy Charlie, he's about to give him the chocolate factory, he says, well, Charlie, did anybody ever tell you the story of the little boy who suddenly got everything he ever wanted? Charlie's eyes get like saucers and he says, no, what happened to him? Gene Wilder says, he lived happily ever after. Okay, so working on the Aladdin VR, I described it as a once in every 5 years opportunity, and I stand by that assessment. It forever changed me. It wasn't just that it was good work and I got to be a part of it, but it got me into the place of working with real people and real HCI, user interface issues. Most HCI people live in this fantasy world of white-collar laborers with PhDs and master's degrees, and until you got ice cream spilled on you, you're not doing field work, right? And more than anything else from John Snoddy, I learned how to put artists and engineers together, and that's been the real legacy. We published a paper, just a nice academic cultural scandal. When we wrote the paper, the guys at Imagineering said, well, let's do a nice big picture, like you would in a magazine.